The Benefactor by Walter Winward. The fat man began to laugh, then stopped suddenly as several passers-by stared at him curiously. He walked on quickly, blowing his nose to cover his embarrassment. Stupid people, looking at him like that. They wouldn't be so inquisitive if they knew who he really was. Oh no. Still, laughing aloud in public was a habit he would have to conquer. Someone might remember him, and that had to be avoided at all costs. But it was difficult to suppress his mirth once it started, and he would wager his life that no one within hearing range could hazard even an approximate guess as to the reason for his laughter. They would probably think him a middle-aged eccentric, or one of those people who compensated for their weight by treating the whole of life as a huge joke. Well, let them think. Not that his thoughts were amusing. Far from it. It was his own cleverness that he found so humorous. Here he was, and there they were, the remainder of the world, and no one recognized him. He could talk to shop assistants, publicans, even policemen, and they were all compelled to be so mechanically polite. One day he would tell them, some day they would all know. He breathed deeply and looked at his watch. Early, as usual. Never hurry on the actual day, that was his rule. Plenty of time for a stroll. He walked to the end of the street, where the cobbles graduated into green fields, and marvelled that the Kent countryside was only half an hour away from his London flat. Just 30 brief minutes, and the bleak backyards and asthmatic sparrows were replaced by tranquil orchards and leisurely cows. A perfect day, the 20th such in the last 5 years. Not perfect because of his surroundings, but because of the errand. Sometimes the sun did not shine. Sometimes it was November and not June. But the day always ended in complete satisfaction, always left him with enough memories to keep him alive until the next time. Not that there was much respite between the jobs. Or was that the correct word? Not really. Job implied work, and he found only pleasure in his activities. In Sunderland, Liverpool, Southampton, or London, he was doing what he wanted at all times. London was his favourite by a long way, but he had already been in the city for almost a year. A year and 3 jobs. He really would have to find another word. 4 jobs, by the time the day was over. Yes, it was essential that he move on, which was sad, because London offered both variety and anonymity. And there was always a problem, in a smaller town, of finding a flat which suited his needs exactly. It had to be secluded, in a basement or lower ground floor, and the landlord had to be someone whose major interest was collecting the rent and not prying into his tenants' affairs. These requisites were easily satisfied in London, but elsewhere... Nevertheless, he had stayed longer than was prudent, and he could return in a year or so. He took a final look at the landscape, sighed aesthetically, and began to retrace his steps. Despite his girth, he moved quickly and easily, and his flabbiness gave lie to a considerable strength. On more than one occasion, his apparent innocuousness had encouraged would-be thieves to make an attempt for his wallet. They invariably became hospital cases. He knew that his obesity and outward amiability were his most valuable assets, and he made capital on both. St. Mary's Children's Home, or as it was locally and less euphemistically known, the orphanage, lay at the far end of the high street, and it was towards this that the fat man made his way. At the gates he paused for a moment to watch a couple of young boys wrestling, and then walked swiftly up to the driveway and into the main building. A few minutes later he was ushered into the warden's study. "My dear Mr. Russell!" exclaimed the warden, rising and extending his hand. "How delighted I am to see you!" Russell, the fat man, murmured something inaudible, and prayed that the other was not going to be his usual irritating self. "And I'm not the only one who'll be pleased you've come," continued the warden, Janet was so disappointed that you couldn't make it last week. It took us an hour to stop her crying." "I was upset myself," began Russell. "Not for myself, you understand, although that was part of it, but because I'd let the child down." "I know what you mean. I know exactly what you mean. And believe me, it's refreshing and comforting to hear someone talk the way you do." He sighed. "Our task is not an easy one, and I'm sorry to say that a number of our visitors look upon the children as nothing more than a weekend diversion for themselves." "Indeed." "Yes?" "I was going to say—" "No, it sounds most ungracious." "Please." "Well, I was going to say that were it not for the appalling lack of married couples wanting to visit our children, I would never have considered a bachelor. I'm sure you understand what I mean." "Of course." Encouraged, the warden continued, "Even with the shortage of couples, if you and Janet had not taken an immediate liking for one another, I should never have entertained it. But she is a difficult child." He smiled effusively. 13-year-old girls always are. "You can rest assured she'll come to no harm with me." "Mr. Russell, I know. Janet's one of the happiest children here. For 3 days after one of your outings, she talks of nothing else. And she spends the remainder of the week looking forward to your next visit. Believe me, I consider it a privilege to know such a Christian as yourself." "You may consider yourself a benefactor, Mr. Russell, a true benefactor." Russell stifled with difficulty the chuckle which was beginning in the pit of his generous stomach. Really, the man was more pompous than ever, and as for Christian and benefactor— A knock on the study door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." The door opened and Janet entered. She saw Russell immediately, and after a moment's initial shyness, flung herself across the room and hugged him. Russell put his arms around her and returned the embrace. He felt an inner surge of acute excitement as he touched the girl for the first time in 2 weeks. The warden looked on, beaming. Russell stood up. Janet held his hand very tightly, as though frightened he might disappear if she let go. "We've got a great deal to do and see," he said, addressing the warden, "so if you don't mind, we'll leave right away." Outside, Janet asked, "Why couldn't you come last week?" "It wasn't possible, I'm afraid. Someone I know was very ill, and I had to look after him." Even as he spoke, the thought of how he had spent the previous Saturday sitting alone at home, wanting desperately to see the girl, yet aware that missing a visit would make her even more anxious for the next one. "Someone more important than me?" "No, of course not. You're the most important person in the world." He saw her brighten. "Did you miss me?" She squeezed his hand. "You know I did, Uncle Ben. You know I did. I thought I'd never see you again." He patted her head. "Silly girl. Where would you like to go today?" "Oh, you choose. You're better at it." "All right, we'll go to London." "London!" "Yes, as a special treat. Don't you want to?" "Oh, yes, yes," she exclaimed. "I've never been before. But isn't it an awfully long way?" "Not really. We can be there in an hour." He watched her out of the corner of his eye as he waited for the train. So exquisite and so untouched. Mere buds of breasts quivered gently under the thin cotton of her summer dress. The short white socks and sandals, instead of detracting from her approaching maturity, emphasized it. She was a creature that all men, in their secret dreams, wanted. A woman with the mind and simplicity of a child. As if to confirm this precept, a youthful porter pushing a trolley whistled at her as he walked by. The girl, embarrassed, looked away. Russell ground his teeth and mentally spat after the youth. The child was not for the likes of that trash. He, Ben Russell, would see that she was never deflowered by some callow adolescent in a filthy bedsitter. Throughout the journey to London, Janet chatted incessantly. Where were they going? What were they going to do? Wasn't it exciting? Russell answered her questions with a patience and bonhomie born of long experience. They were going to Battersea Fair first of all. She was going to do anything she wished. Yes, it was exciting, for both of them, he added to himself. They took a taxi from the station and arrived at the fairground at 3 o'clock. "It's so big," whispered Janet, incredulously. "I've seen pictures of it, but I never realized it was so big." They went from stall to stall, from amusement to amusement. The girl's eyes never stopped exploring for a second, and Russell's eyes never left the girl. At the rifle range, where she failed to hit a single target, he paid the proprietor to let her have a prize, a woolen rabbit. "But I didn't hit anything," she protested. "Of course you did. You just couldn't see from where you were. He wouldn't give you a prize if you hadn't, would he?" In the ghost train, the car they were in lurched, and he fell against her, his hand briefly touching her thigh. So cool, he thought, so deliciously cool and firm. Aloud he said, "Sorry." "What for?" "I lost my balance." "That doesn't matter. I like it when you're close to me. It's less scary." She moved nearer, and he found his hand trapped between her leg and his own. Oh, so firm. Despite the cold of the tunnel, he began to perspire. Please hurry, he silently begged the unseen operator of the car. There had never been anyone like Janet before. The others had always been too prim, or too forward, too fat, or too thin. Never anyone like this. Please give me the strength to continue. Please let me not frighten her. The car suddenly burst forward into the sunlight. The girl straightened up, and Russell's hand was freed. He trembled as he wiped the beads of perspiration from his forehead. Janet stared at him. "Were you frightened in there, Uncle Ben? You look white." "Just the heat." They wandered around the fair until 6 o'clock. Then Russell asked, "Are you hungry?" "I am a bit." She looked at him. "Have we got to go soon?" "Go where?" Back to the home." He smiled. "No, I saw the warden before we left. He's given us special permission to stay out until 11 o'clock, because I didn't see you last week." 11 o'clock? That's wonderful. We've got hours." "A few hours. Just a few hours," he echoed silently. "And as a treat," he continued, "I'm going to take you home and cook you supper myself. Would you like that?" "I'd love it, Uncle Ben. I'd love it." They walked out of the fairground and into the park, Janet clutching her rabbit thoughtfully. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How happy I am. Can't I stay with you forever, Uncle Ben? Can't I? Can't I? I don't want to go back to the home, ever." Russell looked dubious. "I'm not sure about that," he said. "The warden might not allow it." "He would if you asked him. I'm sure he would." "And that's what you want?" "Oh, yes, yes." "You'd have to promise to be a good girl and do everything I told you." "I would, anything." Russell relaxed. The first part was over. It was all too easy. "Then I'll ask him," he said. "Oh, Uncle Ben!" They took a taxi at the park gates, and all the way to Russell's home Janet hugged her benefactor and told him how good and obedient she would be. "Now you sit down and watch the television while I make supper," said Russell, once they were inside his flat. "Can't I help?" "No, you're my guest, and guests must enjoy themselves." After supper he sat looking at her for a long time. Such purity, such rare purity. Hair as black as the devil's heart, and skin as white as swan's down. He ached to touch her, and it took a considerable effort to restrain the impulse. It wasn't time, he reminded himself. But how different she would be from all the others, not like Lola, who had been so willing to pay for her entertainment in the only way she knew. Or Joan, who had been frightened. Or Betty, the coloured girl, whose deformity had so sickened him. Not like any of them, Janet was unique, full of the angelic goodness which Peggy, the first, had possessed. He had tried to save Peggy from a life of corruption, and the church had the blasphemous gall to call his actions indecent. Indecent! Almighty God! Couldn't they see what would happen to her? She'd be 18 now, and probably sleeping with half the men in Christendom. All he tried to do was help. Just show her the way a man would use her. How could that be indecent? She hadn't screamed or complained. She'd been excited and interested. Yet they imprisoned him. Him! A saviour! God, what torture the prison had been! The white coats, the lights, the endless questions. But they freed him. He'd been too clever for them. But Peggy had gone, lost. Poor Peggy! Janet wouldn't be lost. He'd save her. Few of them were worthy of his attention. Janet was. It had taken 5 years to find her. It could take a further quinquennium to find another like her, if he ever did. So everything about the evening had to be perfect. Timing was important. Precision timing. So many minutes for this, so many minutes for that. And as the clock struck 10, "Isn't it getting late, Uncle Ben?" "What?" He realized that he had shouted and quickly apologized. "I'm sorry, I was thinking. You startled me. Late, did you say?" "Not really, it's only 9:30. We've got plenty of time." "Besides," he smiled, "you can't go without seeing your surprise." "Surprise?" "Yes." "A present?" "Yes. Come along, I'll show you." Russell led the way out of the dining room and down a flight of stairs. He opened a door and stood to one side. "There," he said, and pointed. Draped across a small bed was a white, full-length gown. The girl walked slowly across the room. She looked at the gift for a moment, picked it up and began to cry. Russell caressed the nape of her neck. "Don't," he murmured. "But I've never had anything so beautiful. Never in my whole life. Oh, you're so kind." "Put it on," he said gently. Her tears stopped as she stared at him. "But it's a night dress, isn't it?" She held it in front of her. "I can see through it." "Of course you can, and it's not a night dress, it's a sort of bridal gown. Please, put it on. You said you'd be a good girl and do everything I told you." "Yes, but—" "Oh, I see, you don't like it." "It's not that at all, Uncle Ben." Russell turned away with feigned petulance. In the mirror, he saw her trying desperately to decide between hurting him and what she instinctively knew to be wrong. He watched the reflection until he felt certain her resistance had weakened, and then spoke. "And I thought you really wanted to live with me forever." She said nothing for several minutes, then, "Shall I put it on here?" "Only if you want to." He closed his eyes and let his mind go blank. His hand went to his heart in an endeavour to still its frenzied beating. It was here. The moment had arrived. "It's on," whispered the girl, and he turned to face her. She was everything he had imagined. Her head lowered, she stood trembling. Through the thin material he saw the small breasts in all their youthful glory. His eyes travelled the length of her body, taking in with rapacious greed the soft curve of her hips, the smooth roundness of her belly. "Come here," he commanded. The girl, as though in a trance, obeyed. She stopped in front of him, tearful and afraid. She felt an overwhelming desire to cry out, scream. But something seemed to have happened to her voice. It was his eyes that held her. They grew larger and larger until they were as big as pennies. She felt his hands on her body. "It's almost 10 o'clock, he whispered. "Almost 10 o'clock. Come." He led her through a door and into a large, dimly lit room. How strange, she thought. It seemed like a church, a small church. There was a Bible, and there the cushions to kneel on. There was a crucifix. But something was wrong. The cross was upside down. And there was no altar, just a marble slab. "Lie down," Russell ordered from behind her. "On there." There was no fear any longer. It had all disappeared. It was a new and wonderful experience to lie on cool stone, dressed in nothing but a thin gown. Something marvellous was going to happen. She knew it. She could hear a voice above her, chanting. Such a lovely sound. What was he singing? Impossible to understand. Now louder. "Not too loud, please, Uncle Ben. It's too loud. You're hurting my ears. Oh, stop, stop." Softer now, much better. More understandable. What were the words? They sounded familiar. "Evil from us deliver, not us lead. This us give." The Lord's Prayer. That was it. But he was saying it backwards. How strange and fascinating. She would be late back, and the warden would be angry. But that didn't matter. What a story she would have to tell her friends. By her head, his insane eyes gleaming, Russell began to moan. Purity, chastity, virgin, sacrifice. No one like this ever. Frenzy, beauty, milk-white skin. Running red, red over white. Church, hate, Rome, hate, Rome, Rome. Excommunicate, prison, never again. Too clever, revenge. Teach them all. Peggy, teach her. Outcast, hate, hate. Janet, save her. Pure soul, purify, glorify, sanctify. No more, no more. Live, rise, revenge. 10 o'clock. Russell stepped into the girl's vision and looked at her. He showed her what he held in his right hand. As she opened her mouth to scream, he drew the long knife across her throat, and the blood gushed forth. Red over white. Shrieking terrible obscenities at the top of his voice, he tore the white gown to shreds, exposing the flesh beneath. Shuddering uncontrollably, he began removing his clothes in preparation for the final ritual.